Lillian hesitated before sitting down across from me. Her hands were clasped together, knuckles white. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't important," she said in a hushed voice. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. "What is it?" She swallowed hard. "He's back." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world around me blurred, my mind racing with memories I had tried so hard to forget. "That's impossible," I whispered, shaking my head. "We buried him, Lillian." We saw the casket lowered into the ground. Lillian's eyes filled with something deeper than fear. It was certainty. "I know what we saw. But I also know what I saw last night." He was there, standing outside my window. Chills crawled down my spine. "Did he say anything?" "No," she said. "But he was watching me, just like he used to. The same way he did before everything fell apart." A sudden crack of thunder outside made both of us jump. I turned toward the window, my breath catching when I thought I saw a shadow shift in the distance. But when I blinked, it was gone. "We have to go back," I said, the words leaving my lips before I could think them through. "We have to go to his grave." Lillian's expression was one of pure dread, but she nodded. "Tonight." We drove in silence through the rain-soaked streets, headlights cutting through the mist. The cemetery loomed ahead, an eerie maze of stone and shadow. My hands trembled as I pushed open the rusted gate, its hinges wailing like a wounded thing. "There," Lillian breathed, pointing. My stomach clenched as I followed her gaze. His grave had been disturbed. The earth was overturned, the headstone cracked. The name carved into it was barely legible in the dim light. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered. Then, a whisper. My breath hitched. "Did you hear that?" Lillian nodded, pressing against me. The whisper came again, floating through the air like a ghostly breeze. "Why did you leave me?" The voice was unmistakable. It was his. Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled. A dark figure emerged from the trees, its silhouette barely human. I grabbed Lillian's hand, ready to run, but my feet felt rooted in place. "You should have never come back," the figure rasped. Then, with terrifying speed, it lunged. Everything erupted into chaos. Lillian screamed. I tried to move, but an invisible force held me. The air thickened, heavy with something ancient and unrelenting. The figure came closer, and in the dim moonlight, I saw his face, a pale, decayed, yet unmistakably him. "You buried me alive," he whispered, his cold breath brushing against my skin. My heart slammed against my ribs. "That's not true," I gasped. "We didn't know. We thought." "You left me to rot," he interrupted, his voice a mixture of sorrow and rage. "But now, I'm back." Lightning flashed, illuminating the horror before me. His hand reached for my throat, ice-cold fingers pressing against my skin. Just when I thought it was over, Lillian grabbed something from her pocket, a rusted locket, the one he had given her years ago. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We loved you. We never meant to hurt you." The figure hesitated, its twisted features softening for a split second. Then, as if a great weight had lifted, the force holding me in place vanished. The figure staggered back, shadows consuming it as a chilling wind rushed through the cemetery. And then, just like that, he was gone. We stood there, shaking, as the storm finally broke. The first rays of dawn began to peek through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the broken grave. "It's over," Lillian whispered, gripping my hand tightly. But as I stared at the disturbed earth, a single thought sent a fresh wave of dread through me. What if it wasn't? As the first light of dawn crept over the cemetery, I stood frozen, still grasping Lillian's hand. The world felt different now, a place where shadows clung a little too tightly to the corners of everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just in the cemetery, but in me, in us. I wanted to believe that whatever had happened, whatever he was over. But deep down, I knew that the feeling of dread hadn't left. Lillian squeezed my hand, her fingers cold despite the warmth of the morning light. Her face was pale, the storm having left its mark not just on the world outside but within her, too. She looked as if she hadn't slept in days, her eyes hollow from the terror that had gripped her. But her voice was steady, though barely audible as she whispered, "We need to go." I nodded, barely hearing her words. My mind was still spinning, caught between the moments that had just happened. He was alive, but was he really? The grave had been disturbed, but I hadn't seen him in full. Had it been some trick of the storm, a figment of my mind pulled from the depths of fear? We made our way back to the car in silence, the weight of what had happened still heavy in the air. But as we drove away, the shadow of doubt loomed over me. The air felt wrong. The temperature had dropped again, despite the light outside, and the roads were eerily empty. Lillian's fingers gripped the seat beside her, and I could sense the anxiety in her every movement. "You saw him too," I said, breaking the silence. Lillian turned toward me, her expression torn. "I don't know. I don't know what I saw anymore." Her voice was raw, as if the words were being torn from her against her will. "But I know what I felt. He was there. He's not gone. Not really." I had to swallow past the lump in my throat. What does that mean? If he's still here, then what do we do? The question seemed to hang in the air between us, unanswered, as the car's headlights swept across the empty roads ahead. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like we were racing against something we couldn't see, something that had been waiting for us to return. By the time we reached my apartment, the city was bathed in the eerie quiet that always followed a storm. The streets felt almost abandoned, as though everyone had sensed something was wrong. We parked the car and sat there for a moment, neither of us speaking, both lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Lillian broke the silence again. "I've been thinking." I turned to face her. Her eyes were distant, glazed over, and I could feel her resolve starting to harden. "What about?" "About what he said." She hesitated. "About how we buried him alive." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The coldness of them lingered in my mind, echoing like a distant warning. "We thought he was dead, but what if we were wrong?" "But we saw him die," I said, the denial in my voice obvious. We watched as they lowered the casket. Lillian looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. What if we didn't? What if we missed something? What if the body wasn't his? My breath caught. The possibilities had never crossed my mind. Could they have made a mistake? Could someone else have been buried in his place, while he lay somewhere waiting, watching, angry? "I can't go back to that grave," she whispered, voice trembling. But something inside me shifted, and I knew that I had to go. The only way to end this, to understand what had happened, was to confront it directly. The truth was buried beneath the earth, and I wasn't going to let this specter of doubt control my life any longer. "We'll go back," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, but firm. "Together." Later that night, we returned to the cemetery, the moon high and full, casting long shadows over the broken gravestones. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decay. The rusted gate creaked as we entered, the darkness swallowing us whole as we made our way to the disturbed grave. The headstone still stood, cracked and weathered, but it was the earth that gave me pause. The ground was soft and fresh, like something or someone had just risen from it. Lillian shuddered beside me. "Do you think he'll come back?" "I don't know," I muttered, stepping closer to the grave. My heart raced in my chest, a drumbeat that matched the pulse of fear running through me. "But we have to make sure this is really over." Suddenly, a low, guttural growl rumbled from the trees, making us both freeze. My stomach twisted. That sound, it was too familiar, too close to the one that had haunted my nightmares. A shadow shifted in the distance. "Lillian," I whispered, but the words barely escaped my lips before I saw it. The figure, once again, was standing in the darkness, its eyes glowing like embers. "You came back," it rasped, its voice twisted, unrecognizable. I stepped back, my legs suddenly weak. It was him. The same pale, decayed face, the same haunting eyes. But now, there was something different, something darker, something wrong. I thought you were gone," I said, my voice breaking. He laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. You thought you could bury me. You thought you could forget. But I never left. I never died. And now, I'm free. The earth trembled beneath us again. A surge of cold swept through the cemetery, and I realized that it wasn't just his presence, it was something more. Something ancient. The grave itself was pulsing, as if alive, as if the land had become a part of this twisted resurrection. Lillian gasped, clutching my arm. We need to stop this. How? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How do we stop something that's already dead? But before she could answer, the wind picked up again, swirling around us in a chaotic frenzy. The figure stepped forward, its eyes filled with rage. You will never escape me. I will never forgive what you did. I reached for the rusted locket in my pocket, the one she had used to stop him before, and held it out. It had once held power, a connection to the man we had known. But now, as I looked at it, I wasn't sure if it would work again. If it could. And then, with a strength I didn't know I had, I spoke the words that had been buried in my soul since that night. We didn't know. We never meant to hurt you. Please, let us make this right. For a moment, the world seemed to still. The figure froze, as if something had shifted in him, something that he couldn't control. The air around us thickened, and the ground trembled once more, but this time, the tremor was different. It felt like a release. Like the earth was rejecting whatever had risen from it. With a final, anguished scream, the figure staggered backward, its form dissolving into shadows. The cemetery fell silent again, the storm subsiding as the first rays of dawn touched the ground. But as I stood there, panting, my heart still racing, I realized that I could never truly escape the memory of what we had done. Of what we had failed to see. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the grave. The earth was still disturbed, but there was no sign of him anymore. The question, though, still lingered in my mind. What if it wasn't over? The days that followed were quieter, but the silence was a fragile thing. Though the grave seemed to have settled, and the storm had passed, something was different in the air, an unsettling calm that made every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind feel like the prelude to something. Lillian and I tried to return to normal, but nothing felt quite right. We avoided talking about that night, as though speaking of it aloud might summon something more, something worse. Yet, we both knew the truth. Deep down, he was still out there. I couldn't shake the images of the grave being disturbed, of the earth itself pulsing with an unnatural energy. And though we had faced him once, confronted him in the graveyard, a part of him was still alive in this world, tethered to us by something we couldn't understand. I could feel it. Every time I closed my eyes, his voice echoed through my thoughts. You thought you could forget me. You thought you could bury me. One evening, a week after the encounter in the cemetery, I stood at the kitchen counter, absently stirring a cup of coffee, when Lillian's voice broke through the stillness. I'm going back, she said quietly, her words like a cold wind. I turned to her, startled. She was standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Back? To the cemetery? Lillian nodded, the unease in her eyes making my stomach twist. Yes. There's something I didn't tell you. Something I've been feeling. I think we missed something important. The fear in her voice was enough to make me drop the cup of coffee I was holding, the porcelain shattering as it hit the floor. I rushed to her, gripping her shoulders, my voice tight. What are you saying? You're not going back there. We've done enough. I have to, she interrupted, her voice shaking but determined. I think he's waiting for me. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The thought of going back to the cemetery, back to the place where it all began, made my blood run cold. But Lillian's eyes, wide and frantic, held me in place. I knew that look, the desperate, haunted look that meant she was already too far gone, convinced that whatever it was that had risen from the grave wasn't finished with her. With us. The night we returned to the cemetery, it felt different. There was no storm this time, no lightning to split the sky, but the air was thick with tension. The shadows in the graveyard seemed to stretch unnaturally, curling around the stones like dark fingers waiting to grab hold of us. Lillian led the way, her eyes fixed on the ground, a hand clutching the rusted locket tightly. I followed, hesitant, my steps heavy as I glanced nervously over my shoulder. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the disturbed grave. It was still there, the earth torn open like a wound that refused to heal. "This is insane," I muttered, my voice trembling. Lillian didn't answer. She just knelt down, her hands trembling as she touched the earth where the grave had been disturbed. A strange energy pulsed beneath her fingertips, sending a jolt of electricity through me. And then, a whisper rose from the ground, low and guttural. "You came back. You should have stayed away." The world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath us shifting as if it were alive, a living thing writhing in the darkness. My heart slammed in my chest, and I reached for Lillian, pulling her back, but she resisted. Her gaze was fixed on the grave, her lips trembling as she spoke softly, almost as if in a trance. "I was supposed to be with you," she whispered. "You never let me say goodbye." I felt a surge of panic. No. This isn't right. She wasn't herself. The voice wasn't hers. It was his voice, twisted by something dark and unnatural. My mind raced, trying to process the horror unfolding before me. "Lillian, stop!" I shouted, but she didn't respond. Instead, her eyes filled with a strange, mournful longing. It was as if she was listening to someone on the other side of a veil I couldn't see. A low rumble vibrated the ground beneath us, and the figure appeared once more, emerging from the shadows. His face was more decayed than before, more twisted, and those eyes burned with an insatiable hunger. But this time, something was different. The air seemed to bend around him, rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. "Lillian," he rasped, his voice heavy with malice. "I waited for you. I knew you would come. You think you can stop me? You think you can break the chain that binds me to this world?" I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't the man we had known. This was something else, something vengeful, something beyond death. I reached for the locket, the only thing that had kept him at bay before. But when I touched it, the metal was colder than it had ever been, as if the locket itself had absorbed the darkness. "Leave her alone," I shouted, stepping in front of her. "You have to stop. This isn't you." The figure tilted his head, his expression dark and knowing. "You still don't understand, do you?" His eyes shifted from Lillian to me, a dark gleam of satisfaction in his gaze. "I am not just the one you buried. I am the one who has always been. The one who has always waited. You can't stop me, no matter how hard you try." The ground beneath us shook again, more violently this time. The earth itself seemed to split open, a dark, chasm-like crack appearing between the stones. From it, a cold, clammy wind rose, carrying the smell of rot and decay. The grave was alive with something, a presence that was not bound by the rules of life and death. Lillian stepped forward, her face pale, her lips trembling as she lifted the locket. "We're not the ones who left you. We didn't want this," she whispered, her voice full of sorrow. "But we're not going to let you destroy us." There was a moment of stillness, of silence that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, as if the locket itself had come to life, a light began to glow from within, bright and pure, dispelling the darkness around us. The figure's form flickered, its eyes widening in horror. "No," it rasped. "No, you can't. You." And then, with a final scream that shook the heavens, the figure crumbled into dust, vanishing into the wind. The earth calmed. The wind died. The air became still once more. Lillian collapsed into my arms, her body shaking with exhaustion, but something in her eyes had changed. There was peace, finally, a peace that had been missing for far too long. "We're free," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. But even as I held her, a thought nagged at the back of my mind. The cemetery was silent now, the grave still empty. But as I glanced around one last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, deep beneath the earth, something still stirred. Something that had been waiting a long time. And then, just before I turned away, I saw it, an inscription, faint and nearly erased, on the back of the headstone. "You cannot bury what has no end." The wind began to pick up again. A new storm was coming.